My name is Caleb Rowan, and I'm a maritime historian. Or rather, I was one until 3 months ago, when everything I thought I knew about history, about truth, about the very fabric of time itself, got turned upside down. I used to spend my days in dusty archives, piecing together the stories of forgotten sailors and abandoned ports. My life was orderly, predictable, safe. I had a small apartment in Halifax, a job at the university that paid the bills, and a wife who left me because she said I cared more about dead people than living ones. Maybe she was right. That Tuesday morning in March, I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at divorce papers and wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer named Morrison from Sydney, Nova Scotia. He told me something that didn't make any sense. My great-uncle Edward Rowan had died, and he'd left me a lighthouse. I almost hung up on him. Edward Rowan had been dead for 23 years. I remembered going to his funeral when I was 15, standing in the rain while they lowered his coffin into the ground. But Morrison insisted. He had documents, he said. Death certificates, wills, property deeds. The Edward Rowan who had died the previous week was 87 years old, and he'd been living alone on something called Raven's Watch Isle for the past 4 decades. He'd specifically requested that the lighthouse be left to his great-nephew, Caleb Rowan, the maritime historian. Morrison asked if I could come to Sydney to handle the estate. I told him I'd be there by the end of the week, mostly because I had nothing better to do, and because the mystery of a dead man who apparently hadn't been dead was eating at me. The drive to Sydney took me through some of the most beautiful coastline in Canada, but I barely noticed it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd been told. How could Edward have been alive all these years? Why hadn't he contacted the family? And why leave a lighthouse to me, someone he'd never met? I'd done some research before leaving Halifax, and Raven's Watch Isle was a real place. A tiny speck of rock and pine trees about 12 miles off the coast, accessible only by boat. The lighthouse had been built in 1882 and decommissioned in 1980. After that, it had apparently been sold to a private owner. Morrison's office was in one of those old brick buildings downtown, the kind that smelled like leather and pipe tobacco. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd been handling maritime estates since before I was born. The documents he showed me were genuine, as far as I could tell. Edward Rowan, born 1937, had indeed purchased the lighthouse and surrounding property in 1985. He'd lived there alone, receiving supplies by boat once a month, rarely speaking to anyone. The death certificate was signed by the local coroner, cause of death listed as heart failure, natural causes, no suspicious circumstances. What struck me most was the personal letter Edward had left for me. Morrison handed it over with a serious expression, saying Edward had been very specific about when it should be delivered. The envelope was yellowed with age, my name written across it in careful script. Inside, the handwriting was shaky but legible. Caleb, it began, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably confused as hell. I know we never met, but I've been watching your career, reading your papers on coastal fortifications and signal intelligence. You're the only one in the family who might understand what I'm about to leave you. The lighthouse isn't just a building, nephew. It's a responsibility. Come to the island. Look for the loose stone behind the radio in the main room. What you find there will explain everything, or at least the beginning of everything. Trust no one else with this knowledge. The past isn't as fixed as you think it is. I took the first boat to Raven's Watch Isle the next morning. The ferry captain, a weathered man named McLeod, seemed reluctant to take me out there. He muttered something about the island being cursed, about strange lights seen at night, about boats that circled the place at odd hours. Superstitious nonsense, I thought at the time. The crossing took about 45 minutes through choppy waters and thick fog that seemed to cling to the surface like something alive. When the lighthouse finally emerged from the mist, I understood why the locals might think it was haunted. The structure rose from the rocky shore like a bone-white finger pointing at the sky. It was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 60 feet tall, with a keeper's house attached to the base. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the whole place had an air of abandonment that made my skin crawl. McLeod helped me unload my bags and supplies, then got back in his boat as quickly as possible. He said he'd return in a week to check on me, but I could tell he didn't want to linger. As his engine faded into the distance, I was left alone with the sound of waves crashing against the rocks and the wind whistling through the gaps in the lighthouse's iron framework. The front door was unlocked, just as Morrison had told me it would be. Inside, the lighthouse was a museum of another era. The main room was dominated by an old radio setup, the kind I'd seen in photographs from the Second World War. There were charts and maps covering the walls, nautical instruments scattered on every surface, and bookshelves filled with volumes on navigation, meteorology, and signal transmission. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if time had simply stopped the moment Edward drew his last breath. I found the loose stone exactly where the letter had said it would be, behind the radio console. It took some work to pry it free, but when I did, I discovered a small cavity that contained a waterproof envelope. Inside were 3 items: a brass key, a folded piece of paper with numbers and letters that looked like some kind of code, and a photograph. The photograph showed a young man in a naval uniform standing next to what looked like a massive radio antenna. On the back, someone had written Edward Rowan, Signal Intelligence, 1943. The man in the picture looked exactly like the Edward remembered from my childhood. Not older, not younger, exactly the same. The coded message was more complex than anything I'd seen in my research. It wasn't a simple substitution cipher or anything from the standard wartime code books. The symbols seemed to follow a pattern, but it was unlike any encryption system I'd encountered. The brass key was obviously meant for something specific, probably a lock somewhere in the lighthouse. I spent the rest of that first day exploring the building, searching for whatever the key might open. I found it in the basement, behind a false wall that had been cleverly disguised to look like part of the foundation. The key opened a steel door that led to a narrow chamber carved directly into the rock beneath the lighthouse. Inside, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The room was filled with electronic equipment, much of it clearly from the 1940s, but some of it looking far more modern. There were banks of vacuum tubes, primitive computers, and in the center of it all, a machine I couldn't identify. It was about the size of a desk, made of brass and steel, with dials and switches that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. But it was the walls that really got my attention. They were covered in charts, diagrams, and what looked like decades of handwritten notes. Some of the entries were dated, going back to 1943 and continuing right up to the week before Edward's death. The handwriting was the same throughout, despite spanning more than 60 years. The notes described radio transmissions, coded messages, and something called temporal displacement events. One entry, dated just 3 days before Edward died, caught my eye. The signal is coming again tonight, 3rd time this month. Always at 3:17 a.m., always the same message. If anyone finds this record, know that what I discovered during the war was real. The lighthouse isn't just receiving signals from across the ocean, it's receiving them from across time. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what I'd found, about the impossibility of what Edward seemed to be suggesting. Time travel was science fiction, not science fact. But as I lay in the narrow bed in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, surrounded by the sound of the ocean and the groaning of old wood, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but I couldn't quite fit them together. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, I was awakened by a sound I'll never forget. The lighthouse beacon, which had been dark for over 40 years, suddenly blazed to life. The entire building was flooded with brilliant white light that swept across the water in a steady rotation. I stumbled to the window and looked out at the ocean, my heart pounding. There, about a half-mile offshore, was a boat. It was circling the island slowly, methodically, as if it were searching for something. I watched it for 20 minutes, but it never came closer, never signaled, never stopped. At 3:37, the lighthouse beam shut off as suddenly as it had started, and the boat disappeared into the fog. I stood there in the darkness, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The lighthouse had no power source that I could find, no generator, no electrical connection to the mainland. Yet somehow it had operated perfectly for 20 minutes, and that boat, circling at such a precise time, couldn't be a coincidence. As I walked back to the bed, I noticed something on the floor that hadn't been there before. A single sheet of paper, folded in half, with my name written on the outside in the same careful script I'd seen in Edward's letter. I opened it with shaking hands. The message was short and typed on what looked like an old manual typewriter. You weren't supposed to open the east wall. They know you're here now. The transmission will begin again in 7 days. Be ready. It was unsigned, but at the bottom someone had written in pencil, "Welcome to the family business, nephew." The next morning, I woke up questioning my own sanity. Had I really seen that boat? Had the lighthouse beacon actually turned itself on? Or was it just some kind of waking dream brought on by stress and the strange atmosphere of the island? I spent the early hours searching the lighthouse from top to bottom, looking for any electrical system that could have powered that beacon. What I found instead was something far more disturbing. Hidden behind a panel in the lamp room at the very top of the lighthouse, I discovered a logbook that Edward had kept for over 40 years. The entries were meticulous, recording every instance when the beacon had activated on its own. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Every few months, always at 3:17 in the morning, the lighthouse would come alive, and every time, without fail, a boat would appear offshore, circling the island exactly 27 times before disappearing. Edward had counted them, tracked them, documented them with the precision of a scientist studying some impossible phenomenon. But it was the dates that made my blood run cold. The first entry was from October 15th, 1943. The last entry was from the night before Edward died. For over 60 years, my great-uncle had been witnessing the same event, over and over again. He'd written notes next to many of the entries, theories about what was happening, questions he couldn't answer. Why always 27 circles? He'd written in 1978. What are they looking for? And then, in 1991, I think I know what they're looking for. They're looking for me. I spent the rest of that day diving deeper into Edward's hidden archives. The basement chamber I'd discovered wasn't the only secret the lighthouse held. Behind the false wall, I found 3 more rooms carved into the rock. One contained filing cabinets full of documents, photographs, and technical manuals. Another was set up as a workshop, with tools and electronic components scattered across workbenches. The third was the most disturbing of all. It was set up like a war room, with maps of the North Atlantic covering every surface, marked with symbols and coordinates that meant nothing to me. The documents in the filing cabinets told a story I could barely believe. Edward hadn't been just any naval officer during the war. He'd been part of something called the Temporal Signal Intelligence Division, a classified unit that apparently didn't exist in any official records. The paperwork was stamped with security classifications I'd never seen before, and the technical specifications described equipment that seemed decades ahead of anything that should have existed in the 1940s. According to the files, Edward and his team had been tasked with intercepting and decoding enemy transmissions, but they'd stumbled onto something far more significant. The breakthrough had come in September of 1943. Edward's team had been monitoring German U-boat communications from their listening post on Raven's Watch Isle when they detected something extraordinary. Mixed in with the standard military traffic, they'd picked up transmissions that seemed to be coming from nowhere. The signals were powerful, clear, and encrypted with a complexity that shouldn't have been possible with wartime technology. When they finally managed to decode portions of the messages, they found something that defied all logic. Detailed information about military operations that wouldn't take place for days or even weeks. At first, Edward's superiors had dismissed the reports as German disinformation or some kind of elaborate hoax. But when the events described in the transmissions actually occurred, exactly as predicted, the military brass had taken notice. Edward's team had been given unlimited resources and told to figure out what they were dealing with. The answer they discovered was so classified that most of the original team had been transferred to other duties or simply disappeared from the official records. The transmissions weren't coming from German U-boats or any other earthly source. They were coming from the future. Somehow, the specific geological conditions of Raven's Watch Isle, combined with the electromagnetic properties of the lighthouse's iron framework, had created what Edward described as a temporal resonance point. The island was receiving radio signals from 43 years in the future. Transmissions that contained detailed information about events that hadn't happened yet. Edward's notes described the science behind the phenomenon in terms I could barely understand. He wrote about quantum entanglement, about how electromagnetic fields could become locked in temporal loops under specific conditions. The lighthouse, he claimed, was acting like a radio antenna that could pick up signals from across time itself. The massive iron structure, combined with the unique mineral composition of the island's bedrock, created a kind of temporal receiver that operated on principles of physics that wouldn't be discovered for decades. The implications were staggering. If Edward was right, if the lighthouse was really receiving transmissions from the future, then it meant that time wasn't the linear progression I'd always assumed it was. It meant that somewhere, somewhen, 43 years from now, people were deliberately sending information back through time. But why? What did they want? And why was the information being sent to this particular place, to this particular man? The answer was hidden in the coded messages themselves. Edward had spent decades decrypting the transmissions, and his translations revealed a disturbing pattern. The messages weren't random information from the future. They were warnings. Specific, detailed warnings about disasters, terrorist attacks, assassinations, and wars that could still be prevented if someone in the past had the right information at the right time. The people sending the signals were trying to change history, to prevent catastrophes that had already happened in their timeline. But Edward's role hadn't been just to receive and decode the messages. According to his notes, he'd been acting on the information, subtly influencing events to prevent the disasters described in the transmissions. He'd used his position in naval intelligence to feed strategic information to the right people at the right times. He'd prevented submarine attacks, warned of German air raids, and even helped expose enemy agents before they could complete their missions. After the war, he'd continued his work, using the lighthouse as a base of operations for what he called temporal intervention. The scope of what Edward had been doing was breathtaking. Over the course of 6 decades, he'd prevented dozens of major disasters, saved thousands of lives, and subtly altered the course of history. But the cost had been enormous. The stress of carrying such knowledge, of being responsible for so many lives, had isolated him from the world. He'd become a hermit, living alone on the island, afraid to form relationships because he knew too much about what was coming. The most recent entries in Edward's journal revealed why he'd finally reached out to me. The nature of the transmissions had changed over the past few years. Instead of warnings about disasters, the messages had become increasingly personal. They contained specific information about Edward himself, about his health, about his death. The final transmissions had included detailed instructions about what should be done after he was gone, including the exact wording of the letter he'd left for me. The people in the future knew that Edward was dying. They knew I would inherit the lighthouse, and they knew that I would have the skills and knowledge necessary to continue his work. The lighthouse keeper's code wasn't just about maintaining a beacon for ships. It was about maintaining a beacon across time itself, a communication link between the past and the future that allowed for the subtle correction of history's most tragic mistakes. As I sat in Edward's hidden chamber, surrounded by 60 years of impossible evidence, I realized that my life had just become infinitely more complicated. The mysterious boat that had circled the island the night before hadn't been a coincidence. Someone knew that I'd found Edward's secrets. Someone was watching me, waiting to see what I would do with the knowledge I'd inherited. And in 6 days, according to the pattern Edward had documented, the lighthouse would receive another transmission from the future. The question wasn't whether I believed what I'd discovered. The evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too consistent to dismiss. The question was whether I was prepared to take on the responsibility that came with this knowledge. Edward had spent his entire adult life carrying the weight of the future on his shoulders. Now, apparently, it was my turn. I spent the rest of that evening going through Edward's technical manuals, trying to understand how the transmission system worked. The equipment in the basement was far more sophisticated than anything I'd seen in my research on wartime communications. Some of the components looked like they'd been built from scratch, using principles that seemed decades ahead of their time. Edward had been not just a signal intelligence officer, but also a brilliant engineer and inventor. The centerpiece of the system was the machine I'd noticed on my first visit to the chamber. According to Edward's notes, it was a temporal resonance amplifier, a device that could strengthen and focus the signals from the future. The machine was connected to the lighthouse's iron framework through a complex network of cables and antenna arrays, turning the entire structure into a massive temporal receiver. But it was also capable of transmission, of sending signals forward through time to the people who were trying to change history. As I studied the technical specifications, I began to understand the true scope of what Edward had built. The lighthouse wasn't just receiving random transmissions from the future. It was part of a deliberate communication network, a system that allowed for coordination between the past and the future. The people sending the signals weren't just trying to prevent disasters. They were trying to establish a stable timeline, one where the most catastrophic events in human history could be avoided through careful intervention. But there was a darker implication hidden in Edward's notes. If the lighthouse was receiving signals from 43 years in the future, and if those signals contained information about events that were still decades away, then it meant that the timeline was far from stable. The people in the future were living in a world where history was constantly being revised, where the past was as fluid and changeable as the present. And they needed people like Edward, like me, to help them maintain some kind of stability in the chaos of temporal interference. The weight of this responsibility was almost unbearable. How could I make decisions that would affect not just my own timeline, but the future of humanity itself? How could I know which events to prevent and which to allow? And what would happen if I made the wrong choice? If I altered history in ways that made the future worse instead of better? As I sat there in the darkness of the underground chamber, surrounded by the humming of Edward's impossible machines, I realized that I was no longer just a maritime historian. I was a guardian of time itself, a keeper of secrets that could reshape the world. And in 5 days, when the next transmission arrived, I would have to decide whether I was ready to accept that responsibility or whether I would walk away and let someone else carry the burden. The lighthouse beacon remained dark that night, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The signal was coming, and with it, knowledge that would change everything I thought I knew about the world. Edward had spent his life preparing for this moment, training me without my knowledge through the papers I'd written, the research I'd done, the skills I'd developed. Now it was time to find out whether I was worthy of the trust he'd placed in me. Tomorrow, I would begin preparing for the transmission. I would study Edward's equipment, learn how to operate the temporal resonance amplifier, and ready myself for contact with the future. But tonight, I sat in the darkness and wondered if I was strong enough to carry the weight of time itself on my shoulders, the way Edward had for so many years. The lighthouse keeper's code was more than just a responsibility. It was a calling, a purpose that transcended the boundaries of normal human existence. And whether I was ready or not, that calling was now mine. The third day on Raven's Watch Isle, I barely slept at all. I'd spent the previous 48 hours immersed in Edward's documentation, and the more I learned, the more obsessed I became. This wasn't just historical curiosity anymore. This was the discovery of a lifetime, proof that everything we thought we knew about the nature of time and causality was fundamentally wrong. I'd filled 3 notebooks with my own observations, cross-referencing Edward's accounts with historical events, trying to verify his claims about the disasters he'd prevented. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Every major catastrophe that Edward claimed to have influenced showed subtle signs of intervention. Ships that had changed course at the last minute, avoiding submarine attacks. Military operations that had been delayed or rerouted based on intelligence that shouldn't have existed. Political figures who had canceled public appearances just hours before assassination attempts. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight throughout 60 years of history. But it was on that third morning when I discovered I wasn't alone on the island anymore. I'd been working in the basement chamber since before dawn, trying to understand the technical specifications of Edward's temporal resonance amplifier, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots on the rocky ground outside the lighthouse. I killed the lights in the chamber and crept upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. Through the main room window, I could see 3 figures in dark clothing examining the exterior of the lighthouse. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals, systematically photographing every angle of the building. These weren't casual visitors or lost tourists. These were professionals, and they were conducting surveillance. I watched them for 20 minutes as they set up what looked like monitoring equipment in the tree line, small devices that they concealed among the rocks and vegetation around the island. After they finished their work, the 3 figures retreated to a boat that I hadn't noticed before, anchored on the far side of the island. But they didn't leave. They remained positioned offshore, just beyond the range where I could make out details with my naked eye. I realized with growing dread that I was being watched, monitored, studied like some kind of laboratory specimen. Someone knew about Edward's work, and they were waiting to see what I would do with the knowledge I'd inherited. That afternoon, the phone in the lighthouse rang for the first time since I'd arrived. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. The man identified himself as Agent Harrison from the Maritime Security Commission, a government agency responsible for monitoring coastal installations and ensuring national security. He explained that they'd been made aware of my presence on Raven's Watch Isle and needed to conduct a routine inspection of the lighthouse facilities. I told him that would be fine, but something about the conversation felt wrong. The questions he asked were too specific, too focused on what I might have found in the lighthouse. He wanted to know if I'd discovered any unusual equipment, any documents that might relate to wartime activities, any indication that the lighthouse had been used for purposes other than navigation. When I gave him vague answers, claiming I was still cataloging Edward's possessions, I could hear the frustration in his voice. After the call ended, I immediately tried to research the Maritime Security Commission. What I found was deeply disturbing. There was no such agency. I searched through every database I could access, every government directory, every official publication. The Maritime Security Commission didn't exist, had never existed, and wasn't mentioned anywhere in Canadian government records. Agent Harrison was a fraud, and whoever he really worked for had access to detailed information about me and my presence on the island. The realization that I was dealing with some kind of covert organization sent me into full paranoia mode. I spent the rest of that day conducting a thorough search of the lighthouse and the immediate area around it, looking for surveillance devices. What I found confirmed my worst fears. The equipment the 3 figures had installed was sophisticated beyond anything I'd expected. Miniature cameras with telephoto lenses, audio recording devices that could pick up conversations from hundreds of feet away, and what looked like signal interceptors designed to monitor radio transmissions. But there was something else, something that told me I was dealing with people who understood exactly what Edward had been doing. Hidden among the surveillance equipment, I found devices that I couldn't immediately identify. They looked like small metal boxes with complex antenna arrays, and according to the technical markings, they were designed to monitor and record electromagnetic anomalies in the very high frequency range. These weren't standard surveillance tools. These were instruments specifically designed to detect and analyze the temporal transmissions that Edward had been receiving. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying in the lighthouse, I moved my sleeping area to the basement chamber, behind the false wall where the surveillance equipment couldn't detect me. I'd noticed that Edward had designed the hidden rooms with some kind of electromagnetic shielding, probably to protect his equipment from interference. It also meant that I could operate his machinery without being detected by whoever was watching the island. I spent the entire night studying Edward's operational manuals, learning how to activate and control the temporal resonance amplifier. The process was far more complex than I'd initially realized. The machine didn't just passively receive transmissions from the future. It actively tuned into specific temporal frequencies, adjusting its resonance to match the quantum signature of the incoming signals. Edward had developed a sophisticated protocol for establishing communication with the future, a series of calibration procedures that ensured clear reception and prevented temporal interference. According to his notes, the next transmission was scheduled for the following evening. The people in the future operated on a precise schedule, sending signals at regular intervals to coordinate with the past. But the timing wasn't arbitrary. The transmissions could only occur when specific astronomical and electromagnetic conditions were met, when the Earth's magnetic field aligned in a particular way that enhanced the temporal resonance effect. As I worked through Edward's procedures, I began to understand the incredible sophistication of what he'd built. The temporal resonance amplifier wasn't just a radio receiver. It was a quantum computer, capable of processing information that existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. The device could analyze incoming signals, decode complex encryption, and even predict the probability of different future outcomes based on the information it received. But the most disturbing revelation came when I found Edward's communication logs with the future. These weren't just one-way transmissions. Edward had been in regular contact with the people sending the signals, exchanging information, coordinating interventions, and receiving instructions for increasingly complex operations. The lighthouse wasn't just a listening post. It was a command center for a temporal intelligence network that spanned decades. The final entries in Edward's logs revealed why the surveillance team had appeared. According to the transmissions from the future, my arrival on the island had been anticipated, but it had also triggered some kind of temporal paradox. The very act of inheriting Edward's knowledge was changing the timeline in ways that the future coordinators hadn't predicted. They were losing contact with their own past, finding that their carefully orchestrated interventions were no longer having the expected effects. The people watching the island weren't trying to stop me from continuing Edward's work. They were trying to understand how my presence was disrupting the temporal communication network. But they weren't working for the same organization that Edward had been part of during the war. According to his notes, this was a different group entirely, one that had discovered the existence of the temporal transmissions and was trying to exploit them for their own purposes. Edward had been expecting this. His final communications with the future had included warnings about temporal interference from unauthorized sources. The people in the future had been trying to establish secure communication protocols, ways to prevent hostile organizations from intercepting or corrupting the transmission network. But they'd been running out of time. Something catastrophic was happening in their timeline, something that required immediate intervention in the past. As I read through these revelations, I realized that I wasn't just inheriting Edward's equipment and knowledge. I was inheriting his enemies as well. The surveillance team outside wasn't the only threat I faced. There were others, organizations that had been hunting for the source of the temporal transmissions for decades. Edward had managed to stay hidden through careful planning and constant vigilance, but my arrival had exposed the lighthouse's location to people who would stop at nothing to control the technology. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. I wasn't just a historian anymore. I was a soldier in a war that was being fought across time itself. A conflict between those who wanted to use temporal communication to prevent disasters and those who wanted to exploit it for power and profit. And I had less than 24 hours to prepare for a transmission that could change the course of human history. That morning, I made contact with Amara Cross, my former colleague from the university. Amara was one of the few people I trusted completely, a brilliant cryptographer who'd helped me decode historical documents in the past. I needed her expertise to understand the full scope of Edward's encryption systems, but I couldn't risk exposing her to the dangers I was facing. I sent her encrypted files through a secure connection, asking her to analyze the mathematical foundations of Edward's temporal communication protocols. Her response came back within hours, and it confirmed my worst fears. The encryption Edward had been using was based on quantum entanglement principles that wouldn't be discovered for another 20 years. The mathematical foundations of his system required knowledge of physics that didn't exist in our timeline. The only way Edward could have developed this technology was if he'd received the technical specifications from the future itself. This meant that the temporal communication network was more than just an intelligence operation. It was a bootstrap paradox, a closed loop where the technology needed to establish communication with the future had to be provided by the future itself. Edward hadn't invented the temporal resonance amplifier. He'd built it according to plans that had been transmitted back through time by people who already knew how to build it. The implications were staggering. If the technology was a bootstrap paradox, then it meant that the timeline I was living in was already an altered version of history. The original timeline, whatever that might have been, had been changed so fundamentally by temporal intervention that it no longer existed. I was living in a reality that had been carefully crafted by people from the future, shaped by decades of subtle manipulation and course correction. But Amara's analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The quantum signatures in Edward's files suggested that the temporal communication network was breaking down. The mathematical relationships that enabled communication between different time periods were becoming unstable, creating increasing levels of temporal interference. The people in the future were losing their ability to send clear signals to the past, and without that communication, the carefully maintained timeline was beginning to collapse. This explained why I'd been chosen to inherit Edward's work. I wasn't just a replacement for a dying lighthouse keeper. I was a last resort, a final attempt to maintain the temporal communication network before it collapsed entirely. The people in the future knew that their timeline was becoming unstable, and they needed someone in the past who could restore the communication link before it was too late. As the sun set on my fourth day on Raven's Watch Isle, I prepared for the most important night of my life. The temporal transmission was scheduled to begin at 3:17 in the morning, exactly 96 hours after I'd first witnessed the lighthouse beacon. I'd spent the day calibrating Edward's equipment according to his operational procedures, adjusting the quantum resonance frequencies to match the incoming signal. But I wasn't the only one preparing for the transmission. The surveillance team had increased their activity throughout the day, setting up additional monitoring equipment and repositioning their boat for optimal observation. They knew something was about to happen, and they were determined to record every detail of the event. I realized that this transmission wouldn't just establish contact with the future. It would also expose the lighthouse's capabilities to hostile organizations that would do anything to control the technology. As I sat in the basement chamber, surrounded by Edward's impossible machines, I understood that this moment would define the rest of my life. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether I could continue Edward's work of preventing disasters and saving lives, or whether the temporal communication network would fall into the hands of people who would use it for their own gain. The Lighthouse Keeper's Code wasn't just about maintaining communication with the future. It was about protecting that communication from those who would corrupt it. Edward had spent his life as a guardian of time itself, and now that responsibility was mine. In a few hours, I would either prove worthy of that trust, or I would fail and watch as one of humanity's greatest achievements was perverted into an instrument of control and manipulation. The machines around me hummed with anticipation, quantum fields building toward the moment of temporal alignment. The future was calling, and I was about to answer. But I wasn't the only one listening, and what happened next would determine not just my own fate, but the fate of time itself. At 2:30 in the morning, I was crouched in Edward's basement chamber, watching the temporal resonance amplifier's displays as quantum field readings climbed toward critical alignment. Every nerve in my body was on edge. Through the small periscope Edward had installed to monitor the surface, I could see the surveillance team's boat repositioning itself for optimal observation. They knew something was about to happen, and their anticipation was almost as palpable as my own. The mathematical precision of what I was witnessing was breathtaking. According to Edward's calculations, the temporal transmission could only occur when 17 different astronomical and electromagnetic variables aligned in perfect harmony. The Earth's magnetic field, solar wind patterns, atmospheric ionization levels, even the gravitational influence of the moon and planets had to be precisely calibrated for the quantum entanglement effect to bridge the 43-year gap between past and future. At 3:10, the lighthouse's iron framework began to resonate with a low, almost inaudible hum. The temporal resonance amplifier's displays showed quantum field fluctuations building toward the threshold frequency, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing up from the electromagnetic interference. Edward's notes had warned me about this moment. The few minutes before transmission, when the boundary between time streams became thin enough to allow communication across decades. Working with Amara over the previous days had given me insights that Edward's documentation alone couldn't provide. Her analysis of the quantum encryption protocols had revealed something extraordinary about the nature of the temporal communication network. The signals weren't just being transmitted from 43 years in the future. They were being transmitted from multiple possible futures, parallel timelines where different versions of history had played out based on the success or failure of past interventions. The people sending the signals weren't living in a single, fixed future. They were coordinating across multiple timeline variants, comparing outcomes, sharing information about which interventions had been successful and which had led to disaster. The temporal communication network was essentially a quantum computer that could process information from multiple parallel realities simultaneously, allowing the operators to optimize their interventions for the best possible outcomes. At 3:15, 2 minutes before transmission, something unexpected happened. The old radio in the main room crackled to life, and through the static, I heard a voice I'd never encountered before. It was speaking in code, using the same encryption patterns I'd found in Edward's journals, but the message was urgent, almost panicked. I scrambled to decode the transmission in real time, my hands shaking as I worked through the mathematical transformations. The message was a warning. The surveillance team outside wasn't just monitoring the lighthouse. They were preparing to interfere with the transmission, using some kind of electromagnetic disruption device to block or corrupt the signal from the future. According to the voice on the radio, this interference attempt was part of a larger operation to capture and reverse engineer the temporal communication technology for military applications. But the warning came with even more disturbing information. The organization behind the surveillance team had been tracking temporal anomalies for decades, following the trail of Edwards' interventions through careful analysis of historical records. They'd identified dozens of events where subtle changes in timing or information flow had prevented disasters, and they'd traced these interventions back to a single source somewhere off the Nova Scotia coast. What made this truly terrifying was the realization that these people understood the potential applications of temporal communication far better than I'd imagined. They weren't just interested in preventing disasters or changing history. They were planning to use the technology to manipulate financial markets, political elections, and military conflicts. With access to information from the future, they could essentially control the present, reshaping reality according to their own agenda. At 3:17 precisely, the lighthouse beacon blazed to life with an intensity that turned night into day. But this time, I was ready for it. I was monitoring the transmission through Edwards' equipment, watching as quantum-encrypted data streams flowed through the temporal resonance amplifier at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible with any known technology. The sheer volume of information being transmitted was staggering. Compressed data packets that contained decades of historical analysis, scientific discoveries, and strategic intelligence. But something was wrong. The signal was fragmenting, breaking apart into chaotic bursts of static and incomplete data. Through the periscope, I could see the surveillance team activating their interference device, a large antenna array that was broadcasting some kind of electromagnetic countermeasure designed to disrupt the temporal transmission. They were jamming the signal from the future, preventing clear communication between the timelines. Working frantically, I tried to compensate for the interference using Edwards' backup protocols. The temporal resonance amplifier had multiple operating modes, alternative frequency ranges that could potentially bypass the electromagnetic jamming. But each time I found a clear channel, the surveillance team's countermeasures adapted, shifting their interference pattern to block the new frequency. They had sophisticated equipment and operators who understood the technology well enough to counter my efforts in real time. That's when I realized the true scope of what I was facing. The surveillance team wasn't working independently. They were receiving instructions from someone who had intimate knowledge of temporal communication protocols, someone who understood the quantum mechanics well enough to develop specific countermeasures. Either they had captured and interrogated someone with Edwards' level of knowledge, or they had somehow gained access to future technology themselves. Through the chaos of electromagnetic interference, I managed to decode fragments of the transmission. What I learned changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. The people in the future weren't just trying to prevent random disasters. They were fighting a war, a temporal conflict against another faction that was using similar technology for destructive purposes. The surveillance team outside wasn't just a government agency trying to steal advanced technology. They were advanced scouts for an organization that was actively working to corrupt the timeline for their own benefit. The fragments I decoded contained urgent warnings about specific events that were planned for the near future. Political assassinations designed to destabilize democratic governments. terrorist attacks that would be blamed on innocent groups to justify military interventions, financial market manipulations that would transfer enormous wealth to a small group of conspirators. All of these events were being orchestrated by people who had access to information from the future, people who were using temporal intelligence to reshape history according to their own agenda. But the most disturbing revelation was that this wasn't a new development. According to the transmission fragments, the hostile faction had been operating for decades, gradually infiltrating governments and organizations around the world. They'd been using their knowledge of future events to position themselves in strategic locations, accumulating power and influence by always being one step ahead of their opponents. The timeline I was living in had already been partially corrupted by their interventions. The original temporal communication network, the one Edward had been part of during the war, had been designed as a defense against this corruption. The people in the future who were trying to maintain contact with the past weren't trying to control history. They were trying to preserve it, preventing the hostile faction from creating a timeline where they held absolute power over human civilization. As I struggled to maintain the communication link, I realized that the lighthouse was more than just a receiving station. It was a fortress, the last stronghold of the legitimate temporal communication network. Edward hadn't been just a lighthouse keeper or even a signal intelligence officer. He'd been a guardian, a soldier in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. The interference from the surveillance team was becoming more sophisticated, and I was losing the battle to maintain clear communication with the future. But through the static and electromagnetic chaos, I managed to decode one final, crucial message. The people in the future were giving me instructions for a last resort protocol, a way to use the temporal resonance amplifier not just to receive transmissions, but to send them. According to the message, the lighthouse's equipment could be reconfigured to broadcast information to the future, creating a two-way communication link that would be much harder for the hostile faction to intercept or corrupt. But the process was dangerous, requiring massive amounts of electromagnetic energy that could potentially damage the equipment or even create temporal paradoxes that might destabilize the entire timeline. The choice I faced was terrifying in its implications. I could play it safe, shut down the equipment, and hope that the surveillance team would lose interest and leave the island. But that would mean abandoning the temporal communication network, leaving the legitimate guardians in the future without any way to coordinate their defense against the hostile faction. Or I could activate the transmission protocol, risking everything to maintain the communication link that might be humanity's last hope for preserving a stable timeline. As the lighthouse beacon continued to blaze overhead and the electromagnetic interference reached critical levels, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I began the activation sequence for Edward's transmission protocol, reconfiguring the temporal resonance amplifier to broadcast rather than receive. The quantum field generators began building toward transmission power, drawing energy from sources I couldn't identify, creating electromagnetic fields that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential. The surveillance team must have detected the power buildup, because their jamming efforts suddenly intensified. But they were too late. The temporal resonance amplifier had reached critical threshold, and the lighthouse was transforming from a receiver into a transmitter, preparing to send a signal that would span 43 years and potentially change the course of human history. What happened next would either save the timeline or destroy it. The lighthouse keeper's code demanded that I protect the communication link with the future, even if it meant risking my own life and the stability of reality itself. Edward had prepared me for this moment through decades of careful documentation and planning, but now I was on my own, facing a choice that would determine whether the forces of temporal corruption would succeed in reshaping history according to their own dark agenda. As the temporal transmission reached critical power, I realized that I wasn't just inheriting Edward's work. I was completing it, taking the next step in an evolution that had been planned from the very beginning. The Lighthouse Keeper's Code wasn't just about maintaining communication with the future. It was about becoming part of that future, joining the Eternal Guardians who watched over the timeline and protected it from those who would corrupt it for their own gain. The moment the temporal resonance amplifier reached full transmission power, reality itself seemed to bend around the lighthouse. The electromagnetic fields generated by Edward's equipment created a dome of energy that stretched from the bedrock beneath the island to the lighthouse beacon 60 feet above. Through the periscope, I could see the surveillance boats being pushed back by some invisible force, their electronic equipment sparking and failing as they tried to approach the island. But I wasn't just observing this phenomenon. I was experiencing it on a level that defied description. The quantum entanglement field that enabled communication across time had somehow synchronized my consciousness with the transmission itself. I could feel the signal reaching across 43 years, connecting with minds and machines that existed in a future I'd never see. For a few terrifying, exhilarating moments, I was simultaneously existing in both timelines. The people in the future weren't just voices on a radio or data streams on a monitor. They were real, living human beings who had spent their entire lives defending the timeline against forces that wanted to corrupt it for their own gain. I could sense their desperation, their exhaustion, their determination to preserve a version of history where freedom and justice had a chance to survive. They'd been fighting this war for decades, making sacrifice after sacrifice to prevent the hostile faction from achieving total control. Through the quantum connection, I learned the truth about the temporal war that had been raging across multiple timelines. The hostile faction wasn't just a group of corrupt government agents or military contractors. They were something far more sinister. A coalition of individuals who had gained access to temporal technology and were using it to accumulate power across multiple versions of history. They existed in several different timelines simultaneously, coordinating their efforts to ensure that no matter which version of reality emerged as dominant, they would be in control. Their strategy was brilliant in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Instead of trying to change major historical events directly, they were making subtle alterations to the timeline, shifting the balance of power gradually over decades. They would use their knowledge of future events to position themselves as advisors to world leaders, as investors who always made the right choices, as intelligence operatives who always seemed to be one step ahead of their opponents. Over time, these small advantages accumulated into enormous influence. But the legitimate guardians of the timeline had been fighting back, using the Lighthouse network to coordinate interventions that would preserve democracy, freedom, and human dignity. Edward hadn't been working alone. There were others, scattered across the globe at strategic temporal resonance points, maintaining communication with the future and working to prevent the hostile faction's most devastating plans. The transmission I was now participating in wasn't just about receiving information from the future. It was about uploading crucial intelligence to the timeline guardians 43 years ahead, providing them with data they needed to prevent a catastrophic event that was planned for their present. According to the quantum encrypted data flowing through my consciousness, the hostile faction was preparing to trigger a global financial collapse that would allow them to rebuild civilization according to their own authoritarian blueprint. But there was a problem. The interference from the surveillance team had corrupted portions of the data stream, creating gaps in the information that was reaching the future. The Guardians in the other timeline were receiving an incomplete picture, which could lead them to make incorrect decisions about how to prevent the planned catastrophe. Unless I could find a way to bypass the electromagnetic jamming, the entire operation would fail. That's when I remembered something from Edward's technical manuals, a procedure he'd labeled as Emergency Protocol 7. Instead of trying to overpower the interference, I could use the lighthouse's quantum entanglement field to create multiple simultaneous transmissions across different probability states. The technique would essentially broadcast the same information through several parallel timeline variants, ensuring that at least one complete data stream would reach the Guardians in the future. Activating Emergency Protocol 7 required more power than the lighthouse had ever generated before. I had to route energy from every system in the building, including the backup generators Edward had hidden throughout the island. The quantum field generators began drawing power at levels that made the lighthouse's iron framework glow with electromagnetic radiation. The very air around the building became charged with temporal energy, creating aurora-like displays that could probably be seen from the mainland. As the protocol reached full activation, I experienced something that changed my understanding of reality forever. For a brief moment, I could perceive multiple timeline variants simultaneously, seeing different versions of the same events playing out across parallel histories. In some timelines, the hostile faction had already achieved total control. In others, they'd been defeated years ago. But in most of them, the war was still being fought, with the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The version of reality I was living in was crucial because it contained the lighthouse, the most powerful temporal communication node in the entire network. If the hostile faction could capture and control this facility, they could disrupt communication between all the other timeline variants, effectively winning the war across multiple realities simultaneously. That's why the surveillance team had been so determined to interfere with the transmission. They weren't just trying to steal technology, they were trying to achieve victory across the entire multiverse. But Emergency Protocol 7 was working. Despite the electromagnetic interference, complete data streams were reaching the Guardians in the future across multiple timeline variants. I could sense their relief, their renewed determination, their preparation for the final phase of the operation that would prevent the hostile faction's planned financial catastrophe. The information I was transmitting would allow them to identify and neutralize the key operatives before they could trigger the global economic collapse. Through the quantum connection, I learned about the specific event the Guardians were trying to prevent. In 3 days, coordinators for the hostile faction were planning to simultaneously manipulate currency markets in 17 different countries, triggering a cascade of economic failures that would destabilize governments worldwide. The resulting chaos would create opportunities for them to install puppet regimes that would consolidate their power across the globe. But the transmission was revealing something else, something that made my blood run cold. The hostile faction had been tracking the lighthouse's communications for months, using advanced quantum detection equipment to monitor our transmissions to the future. They knew about Emergency Protocol 7, and they had prepared a countermeasure designed specifically to corrupt the data streams I was sending. As I watched in horror, The quantum entanglement field around the lighthouse began to destabilize. The hostile faction's countermeasure wasn't just jamming our signals. It was introducing false information into the data streams, creating corrupted versions of the intelligence I was trying to transmit. If the Guardians in the future acted on this false information, they would make mistakes that could hand victory to the hostile faction across multiple timelines. I faced a choice that would determine the fate of human civilization across multiple realities. I could shut down the transmission immediately, preventing the false information from reaching the future, but also cutting off communication with the Guardians at the most critical moment of the war. Or I could risk everything on a desperate gambit, using the lighthouse's quantum field generators to create a temporal feedback loop that would destroy the hostile faction's countermeasure equipment, but might also destroy the lighthouse itself. The decision had to be made in seconds. Through the periscope, I could see boats from the surveillance team approaching the island again, their operators wearing protective suits designed to shield them from electromagnetic radiation. They were planning to board the lighthouse and seize control of the transmission equipment, capturing the temporal communication network for their own purposes. I made the choice that Edward would have made, the choice that every lighthouse keeper before me had been prepared to make. I initiated the temporal feedback protocol, routing the lighthouse's entire power output through the quantum field generators in a controlled overload that would create a massive electromagnetic pulse. The pulse would travel backward through time along the same quantum entanglement channels the hostile faction was using to inject false information, destroying their countermeasure equipment and preserving the integrity of the transmission. The moment I activated the feedback protocol, the lighthouse became a beacon that shone not just across space, but across time itself. The electromagnetic pulse traveled through 43 years of history, targeting every piece of equipment the hostile faction had used to interfere with temporal communications. I could feel the pulse reaching across the decades, disrupting their operations, severing their connections to the timeline network. But the cost was enormous. The lighthouse's quantum field generators began overloading, their containment systems failing under the massive energy discharge. I had perhaps 30 seconds before the entire system would cascade into failure, destroying Edward's life work and leaving the legitimate timeline guardians without their most powerful communication node. In those final seconds, I received one last transmission from the future, a message from someone who identified himself as the voice I'd heard on the radio days earlier. He wasn't just a survivor of the original wartime team. He was Edward himself, somehow still alive in the future timeline, having found a way to extend his life long enough to coordinate the final phase of the temporal war. His message was brief but filled with pride and gratitude. The information I'd transmitted had reached the Guardians successfully. The hostile faction's planned economic catastrophe would be prevented. The temporal war wasn't over, but the tide had turned decisively in favor of those who fought to preserve freedom and human dignity across multiple timelines. But Edward had one final instruction for me. The lighthouse's quantum field generators were beyond saving, but the temporal resonance amplifier could be salvaged if I acted quickly. Hidden beneath the basement chamber was an emergency shelter that would protect the core equipment from the electromagnetic cascade that was about to destroy the building above. I had less than 10 seconds to reach the shelter. Racing through Edward's hidden chambers, I activated the emergency protocols he'd built into the lighthouse's design, sealing the temporal resonance amplifier in an electromagnetically shielded bunker carved deep into the island's bedrock. Above me, I could hear the lighthouse's structure beginning to collapse as the quantum field generators finally failed. When I emerged from the underground shelter, 12 hours later, the lighthouse was gone. The iron tower that had stood sentinel over Raven's watch isle for over a century had been reduced to twisted metal and scattered debris. The surveillance boats had retreated to a safe distance, their crews probably assuming that I'd been killed in the electromagnetic cascade that had lit up the night sky for hundreds of miles. But the temporal resonance amplifier had survived, along with Edward's complete archives and the communication protocols needed to maintain contact with the future. The lighthouse as a physical structure was destroyed, but the lighthouse as a temporal communication node remained intact, hidden beneath the island where the hostile faction would never find it. 6 months later, I'm still here on Raven's Watch Isle, living in the underground chambers Edward built, maintaining the equipment that keeps the Timeline Guardians connected across multiple realities. The world above believes that the old lighthouse was destroyed in a freak electrical storm, and the surveillance teams have moved on to search for other temporal anomalies. They have no idea that the real lighthouse still exists, buried beneath tons of rock and shielded by quantum fields that make it invisible to their detection equipment. The war isn't over. I receive transmissions from the future on a regular basis now, coordinating with the Timeline Guardians to prevent smaller disasters and maintain the delicate balance that keeps the hostile faction from achieving total control. But the immediate crisis has passed. The economic catastrophe that would have reshaped civilization has been prevented, and the hostile faction's ability to manipulate multiple timelines simultaneously has been severely damaged. I've become what Edward was, a guardian of time itself, a keeper of secrets that span decades, a lighthouse beacon shining across the years to guide humanity away from the rocks of temporal destruction. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I've chosen. The maritime historian has become a maritime defender, protecting not just the history of the past, but the possibility of the future. And just last week, I received a transmission that changed everything once again. The signal wasn't from 43 years in the future. It was from 68 years ahead, from a timeline where the Guardians had achieved something extraordinary. They'd found a way to stabilize the temporal communication network permanently, ending the war across all realities and ensuring that humanity's future would be determined by choice rather than manipulation. The message contained coordinates for other temporal resonance points around the globe, locations where new lighthouses could be built, where other Guardians could take up the watch. The network that Edward had helped create during the war was being rebuilt, stronger and more secure than ever before. And I was being asked to train the next generation of lighthouse keepers, to pass on the knowledge and responsibility that had been entrusted to me. The Lighthouse Keeper's Code isn't just about maintaining a beacon for ships lost in the darkness. It's about maintaining hope for a species lost in time, ensuring that somewhere, in some timeline, human beings will always have the chance to choose their own destiny. And that code continues, carried forward by Guardians who understand that the most important light we can kindle is the one that shines across time itself, guiding future generations toward the shores of freedom and truth. The lighthouse may be gone, but the light remains, burning eternal in the quantum fields that connect past and future, ensuring that the darkness of temporal tyranny will never extinguish the flame of human possibility.